Pete Hegseth just used a fake Bible verse from Pulp Fiction in a prayer at the Pentagon to justify the war in Iran. So on brand. And all of this is potentially complicated by data showing that young Republican men, people who likely look up to Hegseth, are flocking to the church trying to find holy inspiration for their political beliefs. Now, Hegseth claims that this verse comes from a military source who used it during combat search and rescue missions, saying it meant to reflect Ezekiel 25:17. Right, you have him asking the crowd to pray with him, except the verse that he ends up quoting is almost verbatim to Samuel L. Jackson's monologue at the beginning of Pulp Fiction, right as Jackson's character is gearing up to kill a guy.
The path of the downed aviator is beset on all sides by the iniquities of the selfish and the tyranny of evil men. Blessed is he who, in the name of camaraderie and duty, shepherd the lost through the valley of darkness, for he is truly his brother's keeper and the finder of lost children. And I will strike down upon thee with great vengeance and furious anger those who attempt to capture and destroy my brother. And you will know my call sign is Sandy 1 when I lay my vengeance upon thee.
And just so you know what Ezekiel 25:17 actually says, it's, I will execute severe vengeance against them with furious rebukes. They will know that I am the Lord when I take my vengeance on them. So it doesn't mention anything about an aviator or camaraderie and duty, and it definitely doesn't say anything about Sandy 1, which is a rescue mission commander call sign. Most of that's Quentin Tarantino, along with a few riffs from Hegseth to make it sound more military-like. So that, it ended up receiving some pretty embarrassing backlash. But also, aside from how weird or how hilarious it is to a lot of people, like, it speaks to the bigger issue of this administration's weaponizing of Christianity to justify the war.
Grant this task force clear and righteous targets for violence. Let every round find its mark against the enemies of righteousness and our great nation, and overwhelming violence of action against those who deserve no mercy.
Right, one of the concerns here is that this violent version of Christianity, it could be spreading to younger minds across the country. Recent studies show that 42% of men under 30, they now say that religion is very important to them compared to only 28% in 2023. Young men have even started to grow more religious than young women, which hasn't happened in decades. And you have Bible sales rising along with church membership and attendance as men look for purpose in life that they say the church can provide. Right, and studies say that the men who are flooding the pews are largely Republican, whose numbers are double those of the men on the left. Though I will say that only tells part of the story because all of this is happening as American religiosity is still generally on the decline, which is actually why you have researchers also saying that this influx of Republican men in church suggests political dynamics could be playing a role in all this. And so all of it together, it's something to keep an eye on as you have the top warmonger using the Bible to justify things like bombing schoolgirls and threatening to cut water supplies. Though it's also not just limited to that, because Hegseth's also invoking the Bible to attack the media for its coverage of the conflict while near simultaneously repeating threats to commit what experts say would very likely be war crimes if Iran doesn't, quote, choose wisely and reach a deal with the United States. And that's even as he's now had articles of impeachment filed against him in part for war crimes that Democrats say that he is responsible for. And then in the meantime, the Pentagon's ratcheting up the pressure by expanding its blockade to apply to almost every Iranian-linked vessel anywhere on Earth. And Israel and Lebanon have, according to Trump, agreed to a 10-day ceasefire. So there's a lot that we're going to be diving into here. But as we've covered on the show, Hegseth has repeatedly cast the war in explicitly Christian terms. You've had him literally arguing that American troops are fighting for military victory in Iran, quote, in the name of Jesus Christ. And in a press briefing this morning, you had him comparing the rescue of the crew members of 2 downed fighter jets inside of Iran to biblical miracles and likening reporters in the Pentagon press corps to the Pharisees who criticized Jesus.
A note to the press corps, to the American media. As I just can't help but notice the endless stream of garbage, the relentlessly negative coverage, you cannot resist peddling, despite the historic and important success of this effort and the success of our troops. Sometimes it's hard to figure out what side some of you are actually on. It's incredibly unpatriotic. Our press are just like these Pharisees. Not all of you, but the legacy Trump-hating press.
But there is one notable figure who, based on recent events, would probably disagree with Hegseth's interpretation, and that is Pope Leo. Or with Leo having already said in remarks last month that God ignores the prayers of leaders who wage war and have hands full of blood, which has widely been seen as a veiled criticism of Hegseth. And actually, this week, he used a speech in Cameroon to again criticize leaders who use religion to justify spending billions of dollars on war, saying,
"Woe to those who manipulate religion in the very name of God for their own military, economic, or political gain, dragging that which is sacred into darkness and filth. The masters of war pretend not to know that it takes only a moment to destroy. Yet often, a lifetime is often not enough to rebuild. They turn a blind eye to the fact that billions of dollars are spent on killing, on devastation, yet the resources needed for healing, education, and restoration are nowhere to be found.
And really, whatever you think about that, I will say he's not wrong that war is really fucking expensive. Though also a problem with that is that, at least with the Iran war, we have no idea just how expensive. Or you've had the Defense Department telling Congress that the first week of the conflict cost more than $11.3 billion, but that number doesn't even include many costs that are associated with everything. And since then, we haven't gotten any updates, although you recently had one Harvard academic estimating that the total cost will ultimately amount to $1 trillion. And actually, in a House hearing yesterday, White House Budget Director Russell Vaught was unable to dispel those concerns, saying that he just couldn't give an estimate. Well, he then also claimed that healthcare, education, and low-income energy assistance programs were just riddled with fraud. He defended Trump's request for a massive $1.5 trillion military budget, even though the Pentagon's the only federal agency that has never actually passed an audit. And again today, he just kept declining to provide even a ballpark figure, saying that cost estimates were fluctuating due to factors including the length of the war. And well, yeah, technically, that is a real unknown. We're more than halfway through this 2-week ceasefire between the US and Iran, and there are a lot of different ways things could play out. And with that this morning, before attacking the press, you had Hegseth making it clear that one way is the continuation of fighting, with Hegseth sharing what he said was a message to Iran's military leadership, reminding them that they had been defeated and repeating threats to target civilian infrastructure if they didn't give in to Trump's demands.
We are locked and loaded on your critical dual-use infrastructure, on your remaining power generation, and on your energy industry. But if Iran chooses poorly, then they will have a blockade and bombs dropping on infrastructure, power, and energy.
You also had General Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, saying that he'd like to emphasize
that the United States Joint Force remains postured and ready to resume major combat operations at literally a moment's notice.
He then went on to claim that U.S. military commanders all around the world will now
actively pursue any Iranian-flagged vessel or any vessel attempting to provide material support to Iran.
And as far as exactly what that means, you had the Navy clarifying that all Iranian vessels with active sanctions against them, and vessels suspected of carrying contraband will now be subject to boarding, search, and seizure. And saying that contraband items include weapons, ammunition, combat aircraft, military electronics, but also petroleum products and lubricants due to their essential role in military operations and their contribution to Iran's war-sustaining economy. And so this appears to be part of a broader effort to ramp up the economic pressure campaign on Iran, especially as in lockstep with these announcements, you had the Treasury Department announcing new sanctions on more than 24 individuals, companies, and vessels that it said were operating within the network of an Iranian oil shipping magnate. But, at least so far, the pressure really hasn't yielded any obvious results. You have a spokesperson for Pakistan's foreign ministry saying that a second round of talks between the US and Iran was expected to take place in Islamabad, but he didn't say when. And actually, neither American nor Iranian officials have confirmed as of recording, although both sides have said that indirect negotiations are continuing. And actually, yesterday, you had a Pakistani delegation arriving in Tehran to meet with Iran's foreign minister. But also, even if there is a real desire to end this through diplomacy, it doesn't seem clear right now if either side's actually prepared to compromise. J.D. Vance, who's been leading the talks for the U.S., said this week that Trump wanted to reach a grand bargain in which the U.S. would treat Iran economically like a normal country if it acted like a normal country, and added he doesn't want a small deal. But you then also have an official formerly involved in Trump's negotiations with Iran telling the New York Times that Iran will only make a deal they see as being in their interest, which he argued will most likely be small and transactional. And they added that the Iranian regime just would not capitulate to the administration's demands, just as they did not on the battlefield, in claiming that Trump is unlikely to succeed in trying to force transformational change on a system that feels like it just won a war. And trying to get a deal between Israel and Lebanon may be similarly challenging, although there is apparent progress. Earlier this week, the two countries held their first direct in-person talks in decades. And after, the US announced that the two sides had agreed to launch direct negotiations to end the fight. And then last night, you had Trump saying on social media that Israeli and Lebanese leaders would speak to each other today, but that conversation never took place. And in the meantime, an Israeli airstrike reportedly destroyed the last bridge connecting southern Lebanon to the rest of the country. Then, you had Trump announcing on social media today that he had spoken with each respective leader and said that they have agreed that in order to achieve peace between their countries, they will formally begin a 10-day ceasefire at 5 p.m. Eastern, with him then adding in another post that he had invited both leaders to the White House for talks. Now, at least as of recording, the Lebanese prime minister has welcomed the ceasefire, but there's also been no comment from Israel yet. And soon enough, you had Lebanon and Israel confirming the ceasefire, but Netanyahu saying that Israeli troops would remain in Lebanon in what he described as an expanded security zone, saying, "This is where we are located, we are not leaving." And then it's also unknown how Hezbollah is going to respond. And then even if this does move forward, as we've seen with the US and Iran, getting a more long-lasting deal, that ends up being a whole other challenge. You know, where I want to end this kind of first section before we get into even more news is just this part's opinion. And I've written a little about this on my Substack at philipdefranco.com. Would love you to subscribe there. But you know, growing up, I don't know if this was the same for you. When people would talk about Iran, when we were told about Iran, it was always this cautionary tale, right? It was often described as this backwards country where religious leaders, they decided what was moral, where the government wrapped itself in scripture to justify whatever it wanted to do. Bomb a neighbor, crack down on dissent, silence the press. Where where clerics, they're the ones that tell you what God thinks about your foreign policy. Iran was this place where the state and the pulpit, they weren't just holding hands, it was the same hand. That was the boogeyman, the big bad, that was the regime that we were supposedly so much better than. And understand, this isn't a defense of or an absolving of Iran's supreme leader or the government and the leadership there, but can someone fucking explain to me what's happening in our own damn country right now? Because as someone that's been revisiting his faith, I was born Catholic, I'm not practicing, I'm figuring my stuff out now. But, I'm watching the Secretary of Defense, though he renamed himself the Secretary of War, stand in the Pentagon and lead prayers asking for God for righteous targets for violence. We're watching him justify bombing another country in the name of Jesus Christ. He's quoting Pulp Fiction, calling it scripture. And then I'm watching the president post AI images of himself as Jesus. And also he's attacking the Pope, like the actual Pope, for suggesting that war, it's not great. We're seeing reports that a Pentagon official essentially threatened to kidnap and kill the Pope. We're watching the Vice President of the United States, who is so disgusting that many Catholics are noting that they are crib Catholics so that they're not put in the same frame as the president, telling the head of the Catholic Church to stick to matters of morality, as if that's not exactly what he's doing when he calls out war. We're all watching this targeted at and landing on a generation of young men who are being handed by this administration and those who enable it a version of Christianity that looks less like the Sermon on the Mount and more like a recruitment pitch. A version of Christianity and just faith in general that's not about loving thy neighbor, it's about identifying your enemy, where God doesn't ask you to turn the other cheek, he asks you to lock and fucking load. A lot of the ways a number of people in power of our government are trying to operate sounds a lot like a country that we were told to be afraid of. And a huge fucking thing to remember is that every authoritarian religious state in history, it started with people who genuinely believed that they were the good guys. They believed their violence was holy, that their enemies were demonic, that those who questioned them were probably an enemy. And really, whether you're religious or you're not, whether you're Christian, Muslim, Jewish, or nothing at all, you should care about this. Right? As someone that covers the news, to make kind of your everyday person care about a situation that's happening over wherever there is, a lot of the time you have to point out to how it's going to impact them. In the case of Iran, for some people that ends up being gas is expensive, stuff is expensive, affordability. But these are people that are just trying to survive. You lose the human element when you hear hundreds or thousands or however many people are getting killed. But understand, if you have leaders in the government or the government itself claiming that God is telling it to bomb people, it doesn't stop there. It never stops there. Eventually, it will get around to telling you what God thinks about what you're reading, what you love, how you live, whether you dissent, if that counts as heresy. So yeah, I'm with you. I'm laughing at the Pulp Fiction thing, going, what the fuck is this? This is a joke. Do not let the fact that it is ridiculous and outlandish distract you from what it is actually revealing. The guy running the most powerful military in human history is using fake scripture to bless real violence. We were told that theocracy was the enemy, but it is a whole hell of a lot closer to home than a lot of people want to admit. And then there's more we've got to dive into in just a minute, but first let me thank a sponsor and say, running a business is fun right up until you get stuck dealing with, payroll, legal, accounting, and HR stuff. And that's why today's sponsor, Gusto, has made running a business a breeze, because it takes a bunch of that chaos and just handles it. You see, Gusto is an online payroll and benefits software built for small businesses. It's all in one, remote friendly, and incredibly easy to use, so you can pay, hire, onboard, and support your team from anywhere. It automates payroll, taxes, direct deposits, onboarding, docs, basically all the stuff that normally eats your time up and makes you question why you started a business in the first place. With Gusto, you can run payroll whenever you want for one monthly price, so you're not getting blindsided by random fees later. And they've got benefits, 401k, and access to HR experts, which is huge for when something comes up and you have no idea what the right move is. But switching is actually simple. You can transfer everything over and you don't even pay until you run your first payroll. It's one of those tools where once you have it, you're like, yeah, I should have done this way earlier. So try Gusto today at gusto.com/DeFranco and get 3 months free when you run your first payroll. That's 3 months of free payroll at gusto.com/DeFranco. And just for fun, one more time, gusto.com/DeFranco. But then diving right back into the news, we've got to talk about how former Virginia Lieutenant Governor Justin Fairfax and his wife Serena were just found dead in their home early this morning in what police say was a murder-suicide. But according to Fairfax County Police Chief Kevin Davis, the former Democratic official shot his wife multiple times in the family's basement before then running upstairs and fatally shooting himself. And at the time, both of the couple's teenage kids were at home, and their son was actually the one who called 911. In a press conference outside of the home, you had Police Chief Davis saying that the couple was undergoing a divorce and had already separated, but were still living together, and then added
that this has been an ongoing
Now beyond that, at least for now, we really don't have much more information as a recording. But what we do know is that if Fairfax sounds familiar, it's because he had a troubled and tumultuous political career. He was elected as Virginia's lieutenant governor back in 2017, and he served alongside Governor Ralph Northam until 2022. But then, in 2019, both of those leaders were rocked by a series of scandals. First, we had a racist photo depicting one person in blackface and another in a KKK robe surfacing from a 1984 medical school yearbook page dedicated to Northam. While Northam actually initially apologized for appearing in the picture, he later walked it back, saying that he actually wasn't either of the people depicted in that photo, while also then admitting that he had done blackface before as part of a Michael Jackson costume. And so with a sweeping calls for Northam to resign, Fairfax was next in line to take over as governor. But as his chances of taking that top spot started to become likely, 2 women came forward and accused him of sexually assaulting them in 2000 and 2004. And while Fairfax denied the allegations, he too faced calls to resign, though ultimately both he and Northam served out the remainder of their terms. But still, that scandal hurt his future political career. Right, in 2021, he entered the governor's race, but he then lost the Democratic primary by a huge margin, coming in 4th with just 3.6% of the vote. But as far as this tragedy in Virginia, we're going to have our eyes on it, see if more information comes out soon. But let me say something in the meantime. If you or someone you know is in a dangerous relationship, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-7233, or you can text START to 88788. And let me take this opportunity to say, if you are supporting someone that is going through a divorce or anything, you see warning signs, take them seriously. Resources exist, they're out there, reach out before it becomes an emergency. But with that said, there are also a few more pieces of political news that we gotta hit on today, starting with Trump allegedly telling Marjorie Taylor Greene that it would be her fault if her son were killed as a result of death threats that the president's own rhetoric instigated. Because during an interview with Piers Morgan that aired yesterday, you had Greene talking about how Trump's repeatedly called her a traitor and threatened to destroy her because she pushed for the release of the Epstein files, something that he literally campaigned on. And when asked if she and Trump had spoken since she left office, she said,
"The only time I reached out to him was via text message after I had resigned and he had been attacking me, and I was receiving it in just, I can't even count how many death threats. And but the death threats escalated on one of my children. I was so upset over death threats on my children because of him. And the quotes and the death threat were from what the president had been calling me a traitor. And I'm not a traitor to my country. Standing up for rape victims doesn't make me a traitor. And I reached out to the president and to let him know this is what's happening because what you're saying about me. And he was very unkind about these death threats. And so that was our last exchange.
What did he say to you?
He basically blamed me. He had no compassion for death threats on my children. He blamed me basically that if my son were to get killed, it would be my fault.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, it was, and I said back to him, I said, no one's children should ever be the victim of death threats or have any kind of political violence brought on them because of our politics, because of our disagreements. He had no compassion whatsoever.
With Greene going on to speculate that Trump's mentally unwell and repeating her claims that he should be removed from office over his post threatening to wipe out all civilization in Iran. And of course, this isn't the first time that Greene's spoken out about the death threats that she's received because of her falling out with Trump.
I started getting serious death threats, and a pipe bomb death threat on my home, pipe bomb death threat on my family construction business, and then direct death threats on my youngest child, my son. And those started coming in. And it was dealt with so many death threats. We reported, I think, nearly 773 official death threats.
And while obviously this is horrifying on its own at the individual level, it also speaks not only to the incredible power that Trump has to incite violence and threats, but also his sheer willingness to do so. And I know, understandably, we're always focused on the news of the day, but this is a man who incited a violent insurrection and then functionally condoned and normalized the violence by pardoning the perpetrators. He himself has openly made death threats against Democratic lawmakers and encouraged others to do the same. I mean, Greene isn't alone here. Many other political figures that he's targeted have also faced death threats as a result. It is a known thing that his election lies have led to acts of violence and threats against election workers, and yet he keeps spewing them, actively undermining the democratic process. And the fact that he is continuing and in some ways ramping up his violent rhetoric and election lies ahead of the midterms, it's absolutely fucking terrifying. Because at this point, it goes beyond just modeling dangerous behavior. A number of his supporters have made it clear time and time again that they view his words as a call to action. But then also, this other bit of political news I want to hit on is the situation with the Supreme Court. Because we're talking personal attacks, apologies, more criticism, retirement rumors, successors already handpicked by Trump, and that's barely scratching the surface. And actually with this, let's kind of just go down the line. Justice Sonia Sotomayor just issued an incredibly rare public apology to Justice Brett Kavanaugh for her personal attack against him last week. She was speaking at the University of Kansas Law School when she was asked about Trump's immigration crackdown and specifically her scathing dissent to the temporary ruling back in September that allowed for immigration-related stops in LA. Because in that dissent, she wrote that with that policy, the Trump administration has all but declared all Latinos, U.S. citizens or not, who work low-wage jobs are fair game to be seized at any time, taken away from work, and held until they provide proof of their legal status to the agent's satisfaction. So when this question popped up, she had a pretty strong response, and though she didn't mention him by name, she did reference Kavanaugh's concurrence and suggested that he was out of touch with what it means to be a working-class citizen in America, saying there are some people who can't understand our experiences even when you tell them, and adding this is from a man whose parents were professionals and probably doesn't really know any person who works by the hour or the piece like I do. That comment sparking a fair amount of backlash, including a Wall Street Journal op-ed titled Sotomayor profiles Brett Kavanaugh. But that then led to yesterday when she was being grilled by journalists about those comments, and she actually walked them back and even apologized, writing, "At a recent appearance, I referred to a disagreement with one of my colleagues in a prior case, but I made remarks that were inappropriate. I regret my hurtful comments. I have apologized to my colleague." You know, that sort of public apology from a Supreme Court justice is incredibly rare, but so is, the sort of comment that she is apologizing for. But Supreme Court justices have a long history of maintaining public friendships and collegiality, even between those with the biggest ideological differences. So some saying, this whole situation, it highlights the deteriorating relationships in the court, that we are in different times, right? Even with this apology, it doesn't look like that's a problem that's going to go away anytime soon, especially because others on the court are absolutely not pulling any punches when it comes to criticizing their fellow justices. Right? Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's maintaining pressure on her conservative colleagues over their use of emergency orders to benefit Trump, even going so far as to call those orders back-of-the-envelope first blush impressions of the merits of the legal case, saying the even bigger problem is that the court insists those scratch paper musings be applied by lower courts in other cases, which, is very different from the previous stance that the court took. They used to be very reluctant to step in on cases too early on in the legal process. And so you had Jackson saying there is value in avoiding having the court continually touching the third rail of every divisive policy issue in American life, and adding, in recent years, the Supreme Court has taken a decidedly different approach to addressing emergency stay applications. It has been noticeably less restrained, especially with respect to pending cases that involve controversial matters. But it's also unlikely that we're going to see anything different for a long time. And that's because you have Trump reportedly excited about the idea of appointing yet another justice, as there are rumors out there around Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas. Because while neither has expressly said anything about stepping down, there's been speculation running wild, especially after Alito was hospitalized back in March. There, I'll say he's since been back to work, actively participating in oral arguments. And then as far as Clarence Thomas, there have been fewer rumors, but he's getting older. He's 77 years old. And so even with that little bit to go on, you had Trump telling Fox News that he is ready and willing to appoint someone to replace one or both of them.
It's possible. In theory, it's 2 or 3, they tell me. If you just read statistics, it could be 2, could be 3, could be 1. I don't know. I'm prepared to do it.
And that was also something that was echoed by Senate Majority Leader John Thune, who said this week that the Senate Republicans would quickly fill a Supreme Court vacancy if one opens up before the midterms. And actually on that note and the idea of the timing, you had Trump in that same interview pointing to Ruth Bader Ginsburg kind of as a cautionary tale, saying that her refusal to step down while there was a Democrat in office allowed for Trump to pick her replacement. It's why we have conservative Amy Coney Barrett on the court today. And so you had Trump saying,
Ginsburg could not do it. And she really hurt herself within the Democrat Party. People are very angry at her because I got to appoint people instead of Biden.
And in fact, Alito or Thomas retiring now would be very much in line with how justices have handled stepping down in the past. They're making the choice while their party has the presidency, so their replacement is generally pretty like-minded. Well, we don't know who exactly is on Trump's shortlist to fill a seat. He reportedly seemed interested in naming Ted Cruz, with Trump pointing to Cruz as a potential pick earlier this year, even joking that he'd get unanimous support from the Senate because they want to get him out of there. But at least for right now, nothing's confirmed one direction or the other, and so we're gonna have to keep our eyes on it. But that, my friends, you beautiful bastards, is the end of your Thursday Philip DeFranco show. But I'll also tell you while you're leaving a funny and angry, whatever your reaction is to one of the stories that stood out to you today, comment. I'll remind you that there's more to watch right now, whether it's the brand new Crashing Out episode, which there's going to be a trailer for, or if you missed last night's Philip DeFranco show, I got links in the description, or on YouTube, you can click or tap here. But as always, thank you for watching. I love yo faces, and I'll see you right back here next time.
The president is committing blasphemy. It's blasphemy, Phil.
The president just attacked the leader of 1.4 billion Catholics because the Pope said war is bad and don't kill civilians.
I've been yelling that this man is the Antichrist for quite some time now.
Trump asked, what does teleport mean? And quote, was he kidding?
The First Lady of the United States just showed up and she just went, I have never been friends with Jeffrey Epstein.
He got slapped up so hard his authoritarian ass was like, good game.
And that's not a sketch, everyone. That's just the world we fucking live in.